imagine, if you will, just a really immersive auditory contrast. I want you to picture yourself standing in a narrow, steep-sided valley.
Right.
You're thousands of feet up in the Himalayas. It's mid-June, but the sounds you are hearing are completely alien to that environment.
Yeah, they don't belong there at all.
Exactly. First, there is this overwhelming, terrifying sound of sheer destructive power. It's a low, continuous, deafening roar, but it isn't just rushing water.
No, it's much heavier than that.
Right. If you listen closely, underneath that aquatic roar, there is a grinding, scraping, violent percussion. It is the sound of immense stone colliding against stone.
Like the mountain is tearing itself apart.
Yes, exactly. It sounds like a mountain literally tearing itself apart from the inside out and hurtling directly toward you, and you feel it in your chest before you even hear it.
Oh, absolutely.
And then abruptly, that apocalyptic roar just falls away. The dust settles, the water recedes, and in the sudden, eerie quiet that follows, ringing through the thin mountain air, you hear something entirely different.
Something very small.
Yeah. It is the gentle, solitary, unmistakable ring of a temple bell.
It's a haunting image. I mean, it really is. And that specific contrast, between the absolute violent erasure of an environment and the solitary, almost defiant persistence of a single human structure, that really captures the defining essence of the event we are unpacking today.
It really does. It's the juxtaposition of complete chaos and seemingly impossible survival.
Right.
So, exactly. I want to hold on to that image of the temple bell for a moment because it is central to what we are doing today. So, welcome to this deep dive. If you've been with us before, you know how this works. And if you are new, well, we are thrilled to have you here.
Welcome.
Today, our mission is to comb through a massive, really complex stack of sources we have gathered on one specific catastrophic event. We have raw meteorological data from the Indian subcontinent, incredibly complex geological and hydrological reports, and some truly harrowing firsthand accounts and historical context.
Yeah, it's a lot of dense material.
It is. And all of this material documents the June 2013 Kedarnath floods in the Indian Himalayan state of Uttarakhand. So our goal over the next hour is to figure out exactly how an unprecedented extreme weather event, rapidly shifting mountain geology, and a massive, intense concentration of human beings all collided in one very specific valley.
A very narrow valley.
Right, highly constrained. We are going to look at how these elements combine to create one of independent India's deadliest natural disasters. And of course, we are going to examine the striking physical anomaly at the very center of it all. That temple and the impossible math of how it actually survived.
Yeah, to really understand this, we have to establish right away that what happened in Uttarakhand in 2013, it cannot be looked at as a single catastrophe.
Okay.
In the disaster research sources we're reviewing, this is framed as the textbook definition of a compound disaster.
Right, a compound disaster. Which means what, practically speaking? Like, how is that different from a normal disaster?
Well, it means it was a perfectly aligned, devastatingly sequential chain of failures.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't just a bad rainstorm.
Right.
It was a sequence of extreme meteorological events that triggered massive glaciological events, which in turn, triggered hydrological catastrophes.
So it's a domino effect.
Exactly. You have the atmosphere failing, which causes the ice to fail, which causes the mountain itself to fail. And crucially, all of this sequential devastation struck the worst possible topographical location at the absolute worst possible time of the calendar year.
Wow.
Yeah, every single variable basically multiplied the danger of the previous one.
And as we get into the exact granular mechanics of how all those cascading failures happened, the physics of the ice, the fluid dynamics of the flood, we're going to keep returning to that central, unbelievable image we started with.
The temple.
Right, because right in the middle of a town that was, for all intents and purposes, completely vaporized from the map, an ancient 1,000-year-old stone temple stood virtually undamaged.
Yeah, it's incredible.
And it wasn't saved by magic. It was saved by the physical, geometric intervention of a single, massive, perfectly placed rock.
I mean, it sounds like a cinematic contrivance, right? Or some kind of myth.
It really does.
But it is a thoroughly documented, scientifically scrutinized physical reality.
Yeah.
But we can't just jump straight to the rock.
No, we need the context.
Right. To understand how that temple survived and the horrifying reality of why so many thousands of people around it did not, we first have to understand the canvas this disaster was painted on.
Right.
We need to look at the unique, hostile geography of this specific region and the massive human bottleneck that was occupying it during that specific week in June.
So let's set that scene, because reading through the topographical reports, the geography here doesn't just set the stage, it is actually the primary weapon.
Yes.
We are talking about Kedarnath, located incredibly deep in the Indian Himalayas. And let's calibrate our expectations here for a second. This is not a tourist trap just off a paved highway.
Not at all.
It sits at a staggering elevation of well over 11,000 feet, so the air is noticeably thin.
Very thin.
You are dealing with lower oxygen levels, dropping temperatures, and extreme weather volatility just on, a normal Tuesday. And getting there is half the battle. You have to undertake a long, grueling trek along the Mandakini River Valley.
And that river valley is essential to understanding the mechanics of what went wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, the topography of the Mandakini River Valley is characterized by deep, plunging gorges, highly fractured tectonic rock faces, and incredibly steep gradients.
Right.
This is a classic V-shaped valley, carved aggressively by the river over millennia.
Wait, I need to stop you there because when I was looking at the topographical maps and reading the accounts, valley almost feels like the wrong word.
Oh, absolutely.
You described this area earlier as a funnel, but a funnel implies things just flow through easily. Looking at these steep gradient maps, this looks much more like a dead-end trap.
Yes.
Was there literally any high ground for people to scramble up when things started going wrong?
That is exactly the right distinction to make. Calling it a funnel is honestly too generous.
Okay.
The slopes flanking the Mandakini River are towering, I mean practically vertical in some stretches, and highly unstable. There is virtually no flat lateral ground.
You can't just go sideways.
No, you cannot just hike sideways up the canyon wall to escape a rising river. The walls are sheer rock and loose scree. So you are essentially locked into a narrow, constrained chute.
Wow.
Yeah, your only viable vectors of movement are forward, climbing higher up the valley through the temple, or backward, retreating miles down the valley.
So it's just a topographical dead end.
Yeah.
And yet, despite how inherently hostile and remote this specific dead end is, it is the site of immense, almost unfathomable cultural and religious devotion. Kedarnath is one of the primary destinations of the Chardham Yatra.
Yes. And for those who might be coming to this topic for the first time, the Chardham Yatra is one of the most important, massively popular annual Hindu pilgrimage circuits in the world. It connects 4 major holy sites high in the Himalayas, with the Kedarnath temple being dedicated to Lord Shiva. And for millions of devotees, undertaking this yatra is a profound spiritual milestone.
Yeah, it's a huge deal.
It really is. It is often a once-in-a-lifetime journey, sometimes undertaken by entire extended families traveling together from rural villages hundreds or even thousands of miles away.
But the environment dictates when that devotion can happen.
Right, yes.
Because of the extreme 11,000-foot elevation in the brutal Himalayan winters, the temple and the valley are completely inaccessible for much of the year.
Completely cut off.
Yeah, the entire town is buried under heavy snow and essentially abandoned. So the window for this massive pilgrimage is tightly compressed.
Precisely. The snow's clear in the late spring, and you have this very narrow warm weather window before the deep winter sets in again. And that demographic compression brings us to the fatal timing of this event.
Right. Let's look at the calendar. Mid-June 2013. This is the absolute peak of the pilgrimage season.
The absolute peak.
The baseline population of the Kedarnath Valley during the winter is 0. Even during the early spring, it's just a tiny handful of local residents, temple administrators, and, a few rugged locals setting up the seasonal infrastructure.
It's an empty canyon.
Right, empty. But in June, that population swells in a way that kind of defies belief.
The transformation is staggering. I mean, within a matter of weeks, you have hundreds of thousands of pilgrims, foreign tourists, daily wage laborers, porters, mule drivers, and itinerant merchants flooding into this tightly constrained space.
It's a boom town.
It really is. It becomes a bustling, high-altitude metropolis built almost entirely out of temporary, fragile infrastructure.
I was really struggling to grasp the sheer scale of this while reading the reports, and the numbers just sort of wash over you.
Yeah, it's hard to visualize.
It is. So I tried to think of a way to visualize this for you, the listener. Imagine taking the entire population of a mid-sized American city, let's say Dayton, Ohio, or Syracuse, New York.
Okay, that's a good comparison.
You take every man, woman, and child in that city, and you physically funnel all of them into a single remote high-altitude canyon with essentially one narrow, winding dirt path in and out.
Yeah.
They are sleeping in canvas tents, temporary tin-roofed guest houses, and literally just sleeping bags on the side of the trail. And remember, as we just established, there is nowhere to go laterally.
And we have to factor in the physical condition of that population, too.
Oh, true.
You have this massive influx of people, the vast majority of whom are completely unfamiliar with extreme alpine environments. They are far from home.
Right.
They are often exhausted from the difficult altitude, dealing with mild hypoxia, and physically drained from the exertion of the trek itself. They are entirely reliant on a fragile supply chain for food and shelter.
So you have hundreds of thousands of vulnerable people effectively trapped in this topographical trap.
Yes.
But here's the thing, they've been doing this pilgrimage for centuries. The geography alone doesn't cause a disaster. The geography was just the powder keg. The spark that lit it required something else, because a massive geological hazard happening in a remote, empty Himalayan valley is just Earth doing what Earth does.
Right. It's just geology.
Yeah, it reshapes the landscape, maybe blocks a river for a few days, but it goes largely unnoticed by human society.
Exactly. A landslide without people is just geology. But when you place a mid-sized city's worth of transient, exhausted people into the direct, unavoidable path of that hazard, in an environment where escape routes are geometrically impossible, that geological hazard is instantly transformed into a catastrophic human tragedy.
Wow.
The intense human concentration essentially weaponized the geography. The bottleneck effect meant that when the mountains finally gave way, there was physically nowhere for these hundreds of thousands of people to run.
So the powder keg is set, the people are locked in the canyon, now we need to look at the trigger. How did the sky and the mountains above them simultaneously decide to give way?
This brings us to the meteorological anomaly. And the data pinpoints this exactly between June 14th and 17th, 2013.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah, the weather sources we are analyzing show us that this was not just a heavy storm. It was an incredibly unusual, early, and violently intense monsoon system.
Let's break down the mechanics of that weather system. Usually, the Indian summer monsoon arrives in this northwestern part of the Himalayas a bit later in the season, right?
Usually, if you look at the historical meteorological averages, the monsoon doesn't hit the Uttarakhand region until much later in June or even early July.
Okay.
And when it does arrive, it is typically a gradual onset. You get a buildup of humidity, some scattered showers, and then the sustained rains begin. But the atmospheric dynamics in 2013 were highly anomalous.
How so?
Well, the monsoon system surged northwest across the subcontinent much faster than anyone predicted. It was incredibly early, and it was carrying an immense payload of moisture from the Bay of Bengal.
But the early monsoon wasn't acting alone. The reports keep highlighting this interaction with something called a western disturbance. I want to make sure we really understand the physics of this collision. What exactly is a western disturbance, and why did it matter so much here?
A western disturbance is essentially an extratropical storm system. It originates far away, typically in the Mediterranean region or the Caspian Sea.
Okay, so way out west.
Right. It sweeps across the Middle East and brings sudden, distinct winter and pre-monsoon precipitation to the northwestern parts of the Indian subcontinent. It is a completely separate meteorological mechanism driven by the westerly jet streams, independent of the tropical monsoon cycle.
So you have two completely different global weather systems moving toward each other. You have the monsoon pushing up from the southeast, heavy with tropical moisture, and this western disturbance sweeping in from the northwest.
Exactly. And what happened in mid-June 2013 was that the moisture-heavy, intensely energetic leading edge of the early monsoon collided head-on with a very active, highly organized western disturbance directly over the Himalayas.
The analogy that came to mind when I was reading the atmospheric data was like two massive heavy gears in an engine suddenly grinding together and locking completely in place.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Neither system could push past the other.
That's a highly accurate way to visualize it. Meteorologists refer to this kind of event as a blocking phenomenon.
A block.
Right. The interaction of these two massive atmospheric systems caused the entire weather pattern to stall. It lost its forward momentum. It literally parked itself directly over the state of Uttarakhand.
Wow.
Because the system could not move forward or dissipate, all of that combined atmospheric moisture had only one place to go, which was down. It ended up dropping several days' worth of extreme, concentrated torrential rainfall in a matter of just a few hours.
We are talking about hundreds of millimeters of rain in a 24-hour period. The sheer volume of water dumped on the region completely shattered historical meteorological records for the month of June.
And crucially, we have to consider what that rain was falling on.
Right, the terrain.
We aren't talking about rain falling on a flat, absorbent floodplain or a dense jungle. We are talking about unprecedented rain falling on some of the steepest, most geologically fragile terrain on Earth.
Let's dive into the geology of that, because the Himalayas are not like the Rocky Mountains or the Alps. Geologically speaking, they are very young mountains, right?
Yeah?
They are still actively being pushed up by tectonic forces.
Yes. The Indian tectonic plate is continuously driving into the Eurasian plate.
So they're growing.
Exactly. This means the Himalayas are constantly rising, but it also means they are incredibly brittle. The rocks are highly fractured from constant tectonic stress. The slopes are exceptionally steep, often exceeding the natural angle of repose.
Wait, angle of repose?
Yeah, that's the maximum angle at which loose material remains stable before it just slides down.
Oh, I see.
And the topsoil in these high altitudes is remarkably thin.
So you have these incredibly steep, fractured slopes that are already naturally prone to shedding material.
And those slopes were already primed for failure.
Right.
By mid-June, you have early seasonal melting from the glaciers and snowpacks. The ground is already somewhat wet. Now, introduce the stalled weather system. When you drop record-breaking torrential rainfall onto that specific terrain, you trigger a rapid change in soil mechanics.
Okay.
The soil and the glacial moraines, which are the massive piles of loose rock and debris left behind by glaciers, become supersaturated almost instantly.
Let's explain what supersaturation actually does mechanically, because I think people picture a sponge getting full.
Right.
But dirt isn't a sponge. What actually happens to the friction holding the mountain together?
It's all about pore water pressure.
Pore water pressure.
Imagine a pile of sand. When it's slightly damp, surface tension holds the grains together. You can build a sandcastle, right?
Yeah.
But if you pour a bucket of water onto it, the water completely fills all the microscopic pore spaces between the sand grains. The physical pressure of the water actually pushes the grains apart.
Oh, wow.
It eliminates the internal friction that normally locks the material together. The mountain slope literally loses its structural integrity. It ceases to act like a solid and begins to act like a heavy liquid.
That is terrifying.
It really is. The terrain quickly reaches its breaking point, and massive landslides began triggering all down the Mandakini Valley.
It's terrifying to picture. The mountainside basically liquefies and just sluice off into the valley. But here is the crucial turn in our deep dive.
Right.
The landslides and the torrential rain alone, as devastating as they were, and as many lives as they likely claimed on their own, do not fully explain the apocalyptic scale of the event that hit Kedarnath town.
No, they don't.
The math of the destruction in the town itself doesn't add up with just rain and landslides. For that, the geological reports point us higher up.
Yes.
We have to look directly above the town, to the Chorabari Glacier and a specific body of water sitting beneath it. Chorabari Tal, which many pilgrims know as Gandhi Sarovar.
This is where the compound nature of the disaster reaches its absolute peak. What's fascinating here is, to understand Chorabari Tal, we need to understand the specific mechanism of how glaciers interact with extreme weather.
Okay.
And specifically the phenomenon of glacial lake outburst floods, or GLOFs.
Let's really unpack this. I want to spend some time on this because the mechanics are fascinating and, frankly, horrifying. Chorabari Tal is a glacial lake. How does a lake like that form in the first place?
Well, as glaciers retreat, and the Chorabari Glacier has been actively retreating for decades due to global climate shifts, they act like massive bulldozers, scraping up millions of tons of rock, gravel, and ice.
Right.
As the ice melts and retreats back up the mountain, it leaves behind deep depressions in the bedrock, surrounded by massive piles of this loose, bulldozed rock. We call these piles of debris moraines.
Okay.
The meltwater from the retreating glacier fills the depression, creating a lake. But crucially, this lake is not dammed by solid, impermeable bedrock. It is dammed by the terminal moraine, which is a massive, unstable pile of loose debris.
Okay, so you basically have a lake held back by a giant pile of rubble. But let me push you on the mechanics of the failure here, because I really want to make sure we get this right for the listener. How does a lake like that just suddenly break?
Right, it sounds counterintuitive.
Yeah, I mean, lakes are usually pretty static geographical features. We've all seen lakes behind dams. Does the pressure just build up until the wall explodes outward?
It's a great question. And the physics of a moraine dam failure are completely different from a structural failure in an engineered concrete dam.
Okay.
Think of a moraine dam. Not like a concrete wall that might crack under pressure, but like a giant frozen sandcastle, holding back a massive reservoir of water.
A frozen sandcastle.
Yes. It is basically just a huge pile of uncompacted rubble, boulders, gravel, sand, and large chunks of ice buried inside it. As long as it is relatively dry on top or frozen solid, its sheer mass holds the water back.
Right, but we just established that the entire region was experiencing a record-breaking deluge of warm monsoon rain.
Exactly. When that stalled atmospheric blocking system dumped torrential rain over the Chorabari Glacier, two catastrophic things happened simultaneously.
What were they?
First, millions of gallons of direct rainwater were falling directly into the relatively small footprint of the lake basin.
Okay, so the tub is filling up from above.
Yes. And second, and more importantly, the warm torrential rain falling on the surrounding glacier and the massive ice fields caused a rapid exponential spike in glacial meltwater.
Oh, wow. Because the rain was warm.
Yes. You had an unimaginable volume of water rushing down the ice and into Chorabari Tal in a matter of just a few hours.
So the basin is filling up drastically faster than any natural outflow can handle. The water level rises incredibly fast.
Yes, the water level rises until it reaches the very top of the moraine dam. And here's where the frozen sandcastle analogy comes in. As soon as that water overtops the dam, the disaster is locked in.
Why is that the point of no return?
Because the dam is just loose, uncompacted debris, the flowing water doesn't just spill over it like a waterfall over a rock ledge. The water instantly begins to erode the dam itself.
Oh, I see. It essentially starts digging its own grave.
Exactly. The water flow carves a small trench into the top of the rubble. As the trench gets slightly deeper, more water can rush through it. The increased volume of water flows faster, giving it more kinetic energy, which allows it to carve the trench deeper and wider, washing away larger boulders.
It's a feedback loop.
Yes, it creates a violent, exponential feedback loop. We call this process unzipping.
Unzipping, that is a terrifying visual.
The dam literally unzips from the top down. Within minutes, the trench collapses entirely, and the structural integrity of the entire moraine fails. Now, I should note that in the most recent scientific literature, there is still some debate about the exact micromechanics of the initial breach.
What kind of debate?
Well, some researchers theorize that a massive localized avalanche or a landslide off the valley wall fell directly into the overflowing lake.
Okay, like a rock dropping into a puddle.
Exactly. And that created a massive displacement wave, a siege wave, that acted like a sledgehammer, violently punching through the already weakened moraine dam.
Wow.
Others argue it was purely the overtopping erosion we just discussed. But regardless of whether a wave punched the hole or the water eroded it, the well-documented macro result is undeniable and terrifying. The moraine dam structurally completely failed.
And when it failed, it didn't just leak. It released a concentrated, catastrophic, sudden release of millions of cubic meters of water, essentially instantly. It emptied the bathtub in one go.
Yes, and it released that massive volume of water directly into the steep, highly constrained, narrow chute of the Mandakini River Valley.
Right into that funnel.
Yes, this was the final, devastating piece of the perfect compound trigger. The atmospheric anomaly triggered the rapid melt and the late overtopping. The glacial anomaly of the uncompacted moraine dam failed, and all of this instantly weaponized the geography.
Which brings us to the terrifying reality on the ground. We have to take ourselves back down the mountain to the hundreds of thousands of exhausted pilgrims, tourists, and locals trapped in that topographical bottleneck at Kedarnath town.
Yeah, down in the valley.
They are already dealing with days of torrential rain. They are cold, they are scared, and they are huddled in temporary shelters. And then the mountain above them gives way. The simultaneous combination of the extreme rainfall, the widespread slope failures, and the massive glacial lake breach funneled all of that volume straight down into their exact location.
And we must emphasize heavily here because this is where a lot of people misunderstand the nature of mountain floods.
Right.
This was not just a flood of water.
No.
When Chorabari Tal breached, the water didn't stay clean. As it rushed down that steep gradient, it violently scoured the valley floor. It picked up all of the material from the massive landslides triggered by the rain. It picked up massive chunks of glacial ice. It picked up millions of tons of mud, silt, and sediment.
And rocks, right.
Yes. And crucially, it picked up massive, solid rock boulders, some the size of small houses.
It transformed from a flood of water into a high-speed debris flow. And the physics of a debris flow are terrifying. It's not just muddy water.
Not at all.
Because of the density of the sediment and the mud, the fluid dynamics completely change. It acts more like wet concrete. It becomes what physicists call a Bingham plastic, or a non-Newtonian fluid.
Exactly.
That increased density allows it to carry objects of immense mass. Boulders that weigh dozens of tons aren't just rolling along the bottom, they are physically suspended in the flow, floating like corks in the mud, moving at highway speeds.
That is exactly right. It is sheer kinetic energy. When you combine the immense mass of the mud and the rocks with the high velocity generated by the steep drop in elevation, the destructive force is almost unimaginable.
I can't even picture it.
The first-hand accounts from survivors who heard it coming describe a sound that was beyond a roar. They describe a wall of water, mud, and rock that sounded like a fleet of heavy jet engines taking off simultaneously.
Oh my God. It tore down the Mandakini River Valley and struck Kedarnath town with concussive force. It essentially erased large sections of the town from existence.
Just wiped them out.
It didn't just flood the buildings. The kinetic impact of the boulders and the mud pulverized them. Multi-story reinforced concrete guest houses, roads, heavy steel bridges, and entire tent camps full of sleeping pilgrims were just gone. Swept away and crushed in a matter of seconds.
Yeah.
And the flow didn't lose its energy after leveling Kedarnath. It maintained its dense, destructive momentum for miles, wiping out entire downstream settlements like Rambara, completely rewriting the geography of the valley floor.
The sheer velocity, the density of the mass, and the sudden, overwhelming impact is why disaster researchers in the Indian media quickly adopted a very specific term to describe this event. They dubbed it a Himalayan tsunami.
I noticed that term heavily featured in the sources, and it really stood out to me. Tsunami is a very unusual term to apply to a mountain flood.
It is, yeah.
We almost exclusively associate tsunamis with oceanic earthquakes, subduction zones, and coastal devastation. Why co-opt that term for an inland, high-altitude river flood?
Well, it is used because the hydrodynamic physics and the resulting pattern of devastation of this specific event mimicked an oceanic tsunami much more closely than mimicked a typical monsoon river flood.
Walk me through that distinction. Like, how does a flood differ from a tsunami here?
If you look at a typical river flood, even a severe devastating one, the primary mechanism of destruction is rising water.
Right. The water level goes up.
Exactly. The river swells over a period of hours or days, the water levels gradually go up, they top the banks, and they inundate the floodplains. It causes massive damage, mostly through waterlogging, slow erosion, and drowning.
Right.
But in Kedarnath, because of the extremely steep gradient of the V-shaped valley and the instantaneous failure of the glacial lake, this was not rising water.
It was a wall.
Yes. This was a high-speed vertical wall of highly concentrated mass. It struck the town horizontally with sudden, overwhelming concussive force. It completely sheared buildings off their foundations upon impact, exactly like a tsunami wave making landfall on a beach.
Oh.
The sheer destructive profile was entirely different from a typical flood.
So we have established the unimaginable physical scale of the destruction. Now we have to ask the hardest question. So what does this all mean for the people who were actually there?
Yeah, that's the tragic part.
We have to pivot to the human cost, and we have to handle this with the extreme gravity and respect it demands. The sheer scale of the loss of life is staggering, but reading through the post-disaster reports, what makes it even more agonizing to comprehend is the massive discrepancy in the numbers we have.
Yes, the accounting of the dead in the wake of the 2013 Kedarnath floods is incredibly difficult. It's highly contested, and the figures vary widely depending on the source.
Right. Let's look at the data. If you look at the official numbers released by the government authorities after the immediate recovery phase, the figures cite approximately 5,700 people confirmed or formally presumed dead.
Yes.
But if you look at the independent estimates from disaster researchers, local NGOs, and demographic analyses of the missing, those numbers range well over 10,000. That is a massive, gaping hole in the data.
That's a huge discrepancy.
It is almost double the official count. We are talking about thousands of human beings unaccounted for.
If we connect this back to our earlier discussion about the demographics of the valley, how the Char Dam Yatra operated and who was actually there, we can understand exactly why this massive variation exists.
Okay.
And it is incredibly important to state clearly that this discrepancy is not a failure of our research, nor is it simply a case of contradictory historical records. It is a deeply tragic, well-documented feature of the disaster itself. The gap in the numbers tells its own harrowing story.
How so? What explains thousands of people basically vanishing from the official record?
It comes down to the transient nature of the population and the lack of digital tracking. Because the valley was suddenly flooded with a massive, entirely temporary population.
Yay, the boomtown effect.
Exactly. You didn't just have registered pilgrims who booked high-end tour packages. You had hundreds of thousands of independent travelers, foreign tourists, daily wage laborers brought in to carry luggage, unregistered mule drivers, and itinerant merchants selling supplies along the trails.
Wow, okay.
In 2013, there was no centralized, mandatory digital registration system tracking exactly who entered the valley on any given day. You didn't scan a barcode to walk up the trail.
So there was no manifest.
Exactly. There was no master list. And here is where the sociology of the pilgrimage makes it even more devastating. As we mentioned, entire extended families from remote rural villages across India, sometimes numbering dozens of people, had pooled their resources and traveled together. When the tsunami of debris hit, it didn't just wipe out isolated individuals in a crowd. It wiped out entire family units. It wiped out entire encampments of unregistered laborers from neighboring countries like Nepal.
Which means there was literally no one left behind to report them missing. If an entire family is swept away and they came from a village 1,000 miles away, the local authorities in Kedarnath have no idea they were ever even in the valley.
Precisely. They simply vanished into the mud and the debris. And because there was no official pre-existing record that they were ever there in the first place, they were completely erased from official registries.
That is just heartbreaking.
It is. Furthermore, the physical reality of the terrain made verification impossible. The topography is so rugged, and the deposits of mud, boulders, and silt left by the debris flow were so incredibly thick, sometimes dozens of feet deep, that formal recovery of remains in many areas was literally, physically impossible.
The valley itself became a mass grave. So the independent estimates, which actively try to mathematically account for the unregistered transient workers, the undocumented independent pilgrims, and the rural families who simply never returned home to their distant villages, push that toll well past 10,000.
Yeah.
It is a stark, horrific reminder of how uniquely vulnerable a massive undocumented population is when trapped in a geographical bottleneck with zero warning.
It is absolutely devastating, and it paints a picture of complete and utter structural and human annihilation. Yet, amidst this total erasure of modern infrastructure, amidst the pulverization of concrete hotels and steel bridges, the very physical epicenter of the disaster yielded an impossible image of survival.
Yes.
This brings us back to the image we started with.
The Kedarnath temple itself. Here's where it gets really interesting, because we have to look closely at this 1,000-year-old temple dedicated to Shiva. It sits right in the middle of the town. We just spent 20 minutes detailing how a high-speed wall of boulders and mud came hurtling down the mountain, packing enough kinetic energy to literally vaporize modern, reinforced concrete buildings.
Right.
The town surrounding the temple was completely obliterated, but when the drone footage came back and when the dust settled, the Kedarnath temple was standing there structurally intact.
And we have to be precise about why it survived. It did not survive because the floodwaters miraculously lost energy and stopped short of it.
No.
It didn't survive because the temple was built on a significantly higher protected piece of ground. The temple was directly dead center in the path of the primary debris flow.
Dead center.
The physical reason for its survival is one of the most striking, perfectly aligned geological anomalies you will ever see documented in a major disaster.
Let's set up the first factor, which is the temple itself. The construction of this temple is fascinating. It dates back to the 8th century, built by Adi Shankaracharya. It wasn't built with modern cement or rebar.
Right.
It was constructed using a technique called ashlar masonry. They took massive, incredibly heavy slabs of gray stone and meticulously cut them to interlock with one another without the use of mortar. The walls are exceptionally thick, designed by ancient engineers to withstand the heavy snow loads and the frequent tectonic earthquakes of the Himalayas.
Yeah, it was built to last.
That interlocking mass gave it incredible baseline structural integrity.
The engineering of the temple is remarkable and certainly contributed to it, not simply buckling under the vibration. However, even interlocked ashlar masonry cannot withstand a direct horizontal impact from a 50-ton boulder moving at 30 miles an hour.
Exactly.
If the primary force of that debris flow has struck the rear wall of the temple head-on, the structure would have been dismantled into rubble.
Which brings us to the boulder. During the absolute peak of the catastrophic flood, as millions of tons of water, ice, and rock are tearing through the valley floor and leveling the town, a single, absolutely massive boulder was carried down by the debris flow.
A huge rock.
We are talking about a rock the size of a small building. And this boulder, miraculously, impossibly, came to rest directly behind the rear wall of the Kedarnath temple, just a few feet away from the stone.
Let's strip away the context for a moment and look at this from a purely physical fluid dynamics breakdown. The mechanics of what happened the moment the boulder stopped moving are utterly fascinating.
Okay, lay it out for us.
We talked earlier about the density and speed of the debris flow acting like a high-speed fluid. When that massive boulder, which happened to be roughly the exact width of the temple itself, lodged firmly into the bedrock directly behind the structure, it fundamentally altered the fluid dynamics of the entire flood in that localized area.
It essentially became a wedge.
Yes, exactly. In fluid mechanics, when you place an immovable object into a high-speed, turbulent flow, it creates what is known as a stagnation point at its leading edge.
A stagnation point.
Yes. The fluid cannot pass through the object, so the massive kinetic energy and pressure are forced to divert around the sides of the object, creating boundary layers. This boulder acted as an immense immovable wedge. It took the unimaginable concussive kinetic energy of the floodwater, the mud, and the smaller destructive debris, and split that force perfectly in two.
Like a ship's bow cutting through a wave.
Exactly like that.
It diverted the primary destructive wave of the tsunami around the lateral sides of the stone temple, rather than allowing that force to plow straight through the rear wall.
Precisely. The flow rushed past the left and right flanks of the temple, destroying everything to the sides and downstream, but leaving the temple itself in a protective hydrodynamic shadow.
It is just staggering to think about the razor-thin margin between destruction and survival there. The chaotic math is terrifying.
Oh, completely.
If you think about the variables, if that boulder had been rolling just 2 or 3 degrees to the left or the right as it came down the mountain, it wouldn't have aligned perfectly with the rear wall. The wedge effect wouldn't have shielded the structure, and the temple would be gone.
Gone entirely.
Right. If the boulder had been slightly smaller, it might have been pushed right into the temple wall by the water pressure behind it, crushing the stone. If it had been slightly larger, its own immense momentum might not have arrested in time, and it would have smashed the structure itself.
Yes, the momentum would have just carried it through.
But it landed, exactly, mathematically, in the one precise geometric location necessary to split the flow and save the building.
It is an incredible, almost unbelievable physical event. And as we discuss this, we have to pause and acknowledge the human element of this anomaly. For the millions of devotees, and especially for the pilgrims who survived that night, they attach profound religious and spiritual significance to this event. They view the boulder, which they now revere and refer to as Bhimshila, as a direct divine intervention. A miracle that Lord Shiva manifested to protect his sacred shrine from annihilation.
And as we review these sources, we are impartially reporting that perspective. We are not here to endorse or dismiss the spiritual lens through which traumatized people process their survival and the survival of their most sacred sites.
Right, it's a very human response.
Faith is how millions of people make sense of the senseless. But scientifically and physically, relying strictly on the geological and hydrological data, what we have is a striking, perfectly documented anomaly of fluid dynamics, topography, and pure geological chance.
It is a perfect storm of physics that happened to save a culturally vital structure. But you're right to point out the chaos of it. It really emphasizes how brutally chaotic the math of survival is in a disaster of this magnitude.
It really does.
Who survives? What buildings are left standing? Who gets swept away? It often doesn't come down to preparation or strength. It comes down to the exact microscopic variables of fluid dynamics and exactly where a single rock happens to lodge itself in the mud. It is terrifying and awe-inspiring at the exact same time.
And that chaotic, terrifying math extended far beyond the immediate impact of the flood. When the water finally receded, the immediate kinetic danger of the debris flow was over. But a completely new, slow-motion nightmare began for the survivors.
Yes, the aftermath.
As dawn broke, the scale of the isolation became agonizingly clear.
The topographical trap we discussed earlier had fully closed.
Exactly. The roads down the valley were simply gone, scoured off the cliff faces. The pedestrian bridges crossing the Mandakini River were washed out.
Just completely erased.
Yeah. The communication networks, the cell towers, the power lines were completely destroyed. You still had tens of thousands of traumatized survivors trapped in different isolated pockets along the Mandakini Valley.
With nothing.
Right. They had no shelter, no food. They were facing freezing high altitude temperatures at night, and they had absolutely no physical way to walk out of the canyon.
Which triggered a response effort as massive, complex, and unprecedented as the disaster itself. The valley was entirely cut off from the rest of India. The Indian government realized the sheer scale of the entrapment and launched a massive multi-agency rescue effort, officially designated as Operation Surya Hope.
Let's talk about the logistics of Operation Surya Hope, because reading the military debriefings on this is just astounding.
It's an incredible operation.
Because the valley floor was completely impassable by ground vehicles and the trekking paths were destroyed, the entire operation had to be spearheaded from the air. You had the Indian Army, the Indian Air Force, various paramilitary border forces, and specialized National Disaster Response Force teams all activated and converging on the region.
And we really need to dig into the aerodynamics and the specific dangers of what they were attempting to do. Flying helicopters in the deep Himalayas is incredibly dangerous under the best of conditions.
Right, let's explain the physics of that. Why is it so much harder to fly a chopper there than at sea level?
It comes down to density altitude.
Density altitude, okay.
At 11,000 feet, the air is significantly thinner. A helicopter's rotors generate lift by pushing air downward. When the air is thin, there are fewer air molecules for the rotor blades to bite into, which severely reduces lift capacity and engine performance.
Oh, I see, so it can't lift as much.
It drastically limits how much weight you can carry. Furthermore, the topography of the Mandakini Valley is incredibly tight. You have pilots flying massive Me-17 V5 transport helicopters and lighter ALH-grooved choppers into narrow gorges where they barely have rotor clearance on either side.
That sounds like threading a needle in the sky.
It essentially is. And they weren't doing this on a clear, sunny day. The meteorological anomaly hadn't fully dissipated.
Oh, right, it was still raining.
Exactly. They were trying to conduct mass evacuations in a valley that was still experiencing heavy, sporadic monsoon rains. They were flying into zero-visibility fogs that would roll up the V-shaped valleys without warning. They were navigating around ongoing secondary landslides, trying to find stable patches of mud to land on because the helipads were gone. The risk of encountering a vortex ring state, where the helicopter basically settles into its own downwash and loses all lift, was incredibly high given the steep drop-offs and the required hovering maneuvers.
The bravery of the pilots and the ground rescue crews simply cannot be overstated. I mean, they were flying blind into a crumbling canyon to pull people off disintegrating cliff faces.
Yes.
And tragically, the danger was absolute. During the operation, some helicopters did crash due to the treacherous weather conditions and the unforgiving terrain, resulting in the heartbreaking deaths of Air Force personnel, paramilitary rescuers, and the civilians they had just pulled from the mud.
It was a harrowing, costly environment. But despite the staggering risks, the sheer logistical scale of the evacuation was an unbelievable achievement. The military and civilian crews pushed their machines and themselves to the absolute limit of endurance.
Yeah, they really did.
Over the subsequent weeks, utilizing airlifts and establishing treacherous, temporary rope bridges across the rapids for land evacuations, they managed to evacuate well over 100,000 stranded pilgrims and residents.
100,000 people. I really want that number to sink in for you. That is unimaginable. Airlifting an entire mid-sized city's worth of people out of isolated alpine pockets, one helicopter load of 20 people at a time.
It's a monumental effort.
Or guiding traumatized, exhausted people by hand across wet, newly carved cliff faces where the roads used to be. It stands as one of the largest, most complex disaster evacuation operations in India's modern history and, frankly, in global aviation history.
And it had to be on that scale because the valley was utterly structurally dead. The aftermath of the rescue left a region completely scarred. But the story of Kedarnath doesn't end with the evacuation helicopters flying away.
No, it doesn't.
In the years that followed 2013, there was a massive, highly debated push to recover and rebuild.
Right. They didn't just declare the valley a permanent exclusion zone and abandon the site. As we discussed, the Char Dam pilgrimage is too culturally and spiritually vital to millions of people. So the government initiated a dedicated, aggressively funded reconstruction plan.
Yes.
And the logistics of that were almost as wild as the rescue. They brought in heavy, earth-moving machinery, but they had no roads. So they literally had to take bulldozers and excavators apart at the base of the mountains, fly the heavy steel parts in via heavy-lift Chinook-style helicopters, and reassemble the machines at 11,000 feet just to start clearing the millions of tons of debris.
They worked to rebuild the retaining walls along the Mandakini River, completely reroute the trekking paths away from the most unstable slopes, and construct new, sturdier, engineered infrastructure around the Kedarnath temple.
Which raises an incredibly important question about the ongoing evolution of the region and, frankly, our relationship with nature as a whole.
Yes.
The Chardam Yatra has not just resumed since 2013. The data shows it has actively grown.
Grown significantly.
It is, once again, a major annual event, but it is drawing even larger, record-breaking crowds than it did before the disaster. The government has countered this vastly increased human presence with significantly expanded disaster preparedness measures.
Yes. The sources detail a completely new paradigm of early warning infrastructure. They have installed advanced meteorological tracking radars in the mountains. They've set up sensors at the glacial lakes to monitor water levels and detect potential GLOFs before they breach.
Okay, so they're watching the lakes now.
Exactly. They've built much more robust communication networks that won't just wash away in a landslide, and they have constructed massive, engineered retaining walls designed specifically from the hydrodynamic lessons learned in 2013.
But we have to view this context critically, don't we?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We must view it critically because this preparedness is an ongoing, highly reactive process, not a completely finished, foolproof one. The Himalayas are an inherently dynamic, violent geological environment. The glaciers are still retreating due to climate change, which means new moraine-dammed lakes are forming higher up right now.
Oh, wow. So new hazards are being created constantly.
Exactly. The tectonic plates are still grinding, meaning the slopes are still fundamentally fractured and fragile. Trying to engineer a completely safe environment in one of the most geologically active and climatically volatile regions on Earth is a perpetual, perhaps unwinnable battle.
So as we pull back the lens and try to synthesize the key takeaways from all these diverse sources, the meteorology, the fluid dynamics, the logistical history, the 2013 Kedarnath floods truly serve as a terrifying masterclass in compounding risk.
They really do.
We saw how climate-linked weather extremes, that stalled monsoon and the colliding western disturbance, interacted with the shifting glacial geology of Chorabari Tal to create an unstoppable physical force. And then, crucially, we saw how that environmental fury intersected with an intense human concentration, all bottlenecked in a single narrow valley, to transform a hazard into a tragedy.
It is a profound, humbling reminder of how quickly the normal parameters of our lives can vanish. I mean, we build our societies, our economies, and our daily expectations on a baseline of environmental stability.
We do. We assume the ground will hold.
Exactly. We assume the ground will stay solid. We assume the rain will eventually stop. But when natural systems break down, when a glacial lake unzips or a mountainside liquefies under poor water pressure, the sheer kinetic power of the environment simply overrides whatever infrastructure, whatever concrete, or whatever planning we have put in place.
It is incredibly humbling. You really have to respect the absolute indifferent power of the mountains. And as we wrap up this deep dive, there is one final provocative thought I want to leave you with. Something for you to mull over as you think about this disaster and as you watch the continued rebuilding efforts in high-risk zones all over the world.
We always have to look at the unintended consequences of human adaptation.
Exactly. As the rebuilding continues in Uttarakhand and as religious tourism to these remote, sacred areas grows by the millions year by year, we are installing better early warning systems and much more robust infrastructure.
Right.
We are building wider paved paths, stringing up stronger cables, and pouring thicker concrete retaining walls. But we have to ask ourselves, does our improved technology and our reliance on these visible safety systems actually encourage us to push deeper and in vastly greater numbers into inherently unstable, dangerous geological zones?
It's a really tough question.
It is. In our relentless quest to master the mountains through engineering and preparedness, are we simply setting the stage for an even larger human bottleneck the next time the slopes decide to give way?
It is the ultimate paradox of disaster resilience.
Yeah.
I mean, the safer our engineering makes us feel, the more risk we are willing to take. And the mountains eventually always win.
Something to think about the next time you look up at a mountain, or trust a concrete wall to hold back the earth. We want to thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly heavy, deeply fascinating deep dive into the Kedarnath floods. Stay curious, stay informed, and we will catch you on the next one.